ladies and gentlemen. I think you're receiving translation, and you will all be able to understand what I'm saying. On behalf of the organizers of the forum, I would like to apologize for the delay in our roundtable functionings. We finished the plenary session out of schedule, but it was worth it. It was very substantive and very interesting. I was very much impressed by all the presentations I heard at the plenary session. I think that by content, by tonality, and by the level of discussion, they differed even from the high level of last year's discussions. But now we are working in the format of roundtables. It's an intermediate phase as a transition to tomorrow, because today's roundtables are dedicated to major issues and problems, while tomorrow we will have nearly 40 roundtables, and they will discuss specific issues. I think you all had a chance to eat something, and for our foreign guests I can tell that according to the Russian custom in farmers' families, when a worker was hired for a season, well, that farmer was sat at the table, was taken to the table and fed whatever he could eat, and if he did it well, the farmer was hired, the helping hand was hired, and he worked well. And as the fairy tale character says, those who eat well work well as well. It's time for us to do a good job, and we are starting the discussions at the round table dedicated to the fighting against new threats to security and the balance of rule of law and the police efficiency. Being a moderator, I would like to intervene with some explanations of the topic of the agenda. And so far I'm going to stay totally impartial, and I'm not going to impose any definition on you. I'd like to focus some focal points so that we could have that logical square. So I think the first stand that should not pose any doubt is that today the world is challenged with unprecedented threats to the security that are multiplying, and that are caused by the move of information, capitals, and goods and people. The world has turned to be totally global, and it is used by criminals, and it opens some ways for criminal acts. The second aspect is that to cope with that, to address that challenge and to maintain the necessary level of security, and the global security in the first place, we must take some new, adequate and efficient measures. It means that combating some subtle means of criminals, we should counter them with similar things. And it is also without any doubt. Then come some new approaches to track, isolate criminals, to collect evidence against them, and the presentation of that evidence in courts, so that the criminal prosecution will result in the court's judgment in full compliance with the rule of law concept. And for that end we need to apply new approaches for that evidence, because those approaches are also to be new, to be in line with new challenges. And here comes the road junction, because the question arises, and that's my final statement, and it is that it's quite obvious, and it can be forecast, and sometimes it takes place. I'm talking about the conflict between the adherence to the rule of law on the one hand, and police efficiency and effectiveness on the other hand, because we will not be understood if we stick to that principle and we leave our families, our people, our achievements and our civilization unprotected. So then options may be diverse. We can see what we can sacrifice and what can be done not to sacrifice anything, but to preserve the rule of law and at the same time maintain the police efficiency. My assumption is that we can either maintain the visibility of the tyrants, but in fact we will move to some erosion of those principles using police methods and techniques that cannot be supported by new approaches for the judge's assessment of evidence involving prosecutors and other judicial officers. Or we will suffer from inefficient police measures. There is also the third option, which is more or less adequate, and that is to shape some new approaches to address those problems. I really hope that our distinguished speakers that participate in the panel discussions, as well as comments from the floor, will bring us closer to the answers to those questions. Some administrative announcements. Since we started later, I suggest each speaker may have a 15-minute time slot for not only the presentation but for 2 questions. So it means that you can speak within 10 minutes, and then we can allot some 5 minutes to ask at least 2 questions if they arise. If there will be some additional questions, those questions will be asked at the end of the session. If somebody wants to sell some quota or the whole quota, well, I don't mind, but for that end we need to have a lawyer in the audience. So my suggestion is that all speakers will make their presentations as they are announced, and then we'll set an open discussion with Q&A opportunity. I would like to ask presenters, being a moderator, I will not just turn the floor and introduce a speaker, but to articulate my special desire, my special question to that particular speaker, given the legal system the person represents or the current situation in that country. So I would like to ask distinguished speakers to take those questions even partially. Well, certainly I understand you have some talking points prepared, but at the same time, if I outline some specific issues, please respond to them. And my final comment is, it took me long to figure out who would speak first and what will be the sequence, but I decided to use the universal system, and it will be the alphabetic order. So given the alphabetic order, I think Mr. Linda Brewer, Assistant Attorney General of the United States, will take the floor. So my specific question to Mr. Assistant Attorney General can be perhaps most concentrated one. I wonder what is the U.S. vision of their role in maintaining world order and still adhering to the principles of the rule of law. I'm not going to recall all those crimes the United States are accused now, that they're going to establish the dominance of the globe. It's all emotions, and it's not that much truth in that. But we can really say that over the past decade, the United States is prepared to assume responsibility for adequate development of the civilization, and preventing or combating some anomalies or disorderly situations the way U.S. politicians and lawyers see them. And still, I think that this practice that really deserves respect, because the United States is not afraid of assuming responsibility to have a war on some most terrible manifestations of terrorism or some other crimes. But at the same time, we have questions about the legal aspects of that activity. There is no doubt that we have to check the activity and operations of some of the most evil person on that planet. However, the method that was chosen, that person was eliminated in a hostile or foreign jurisdiction without any justification. So I wonder how it is accommodated into the US judicial and legal practices as they apply to those suspects who may pose a threat to the United States, and at the same time they can ignore agreements on extradition. And it's not even about the United States or Russia. We can even speak of Spain or New Zealand. However, the thrust of my question is, don't you worry that the claims on the extraterritorial jurisdiction will dominate, will prevail, and it may make a precedent, because we have to do so. But you acted in such a way for the second and third time, and it turned out to be a norm, a standard, which is not reflected in the law, but it is applied and it is in effect. There is no offense, really. I would like to call upon you to give us your open answer to that, because we are all interested to hear that. Thank you.
Mr. Minister, and as I said this morning in the first panel that I was fortunate enough to participate with you on, it's a real honor to be here, and as I said earlier, the Attorney General and I are all delighted to be at this very impressive forum. So let me be very open and address the Minister's question, and I will try to be actually fairly brief. Our entire system that we in the United States try to have is one where we are clear and transparent in what we do. In our country, for instance, we have made it clear that the paramount concern of our department is the security of our citizens and our nation, and that the priority above all other priorities is that to fight terrorism, international terrorism, that's committed to hurting us and hurting our friends all over the world. At the same time, our country has been steeped in its history since the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution that ours is a society of transparency and ours is a society of separation of powers. So that, excuse me, I hope you've all heard me so far. And so ours is not only one of transparency, but one of a separation of powers with co-equal branches. So we have our president and our executive branch that I'm a part of. We have our legislative branch, which our Congress is a part of. And we have our independent judiciary, our courts. All are equal, all are independent, all are a check on one another. And therefore, we believe in our society and in our system, it prevents any one branch from having too dominant a role or for any one branch to become all-powerful, because there has to be a balance. And between that balance, that checks and balances, and the transparency, where when we make decisions, when we fulfill our obligations, we're very clear about it, I think that that's provided a very good check. So, Mr. Minister, we have said, our government has said, our Attorney General has said, that we will do what we need to do to make our country safe and the world safe, and we've attempted to be a leader. We've attempted to be a leader in areas such as anti-corruption and our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I have spoken about, and we're delighted that other countries are following along. And we feel that having an international approach to fighting corruption is important. But that didn't mean that we didn't have to lead for a while. And with respect to terrorism, it's the same, if that's what you were alluding to. Our laws provide that if you are waging a war against the United States or a terrorist, that we have extraterritorial jurisdiction. I might argue with you, Mr. Minister, politely that it isn't in contravention of international law. Rather, we're quite convinced that what we do is consistent with the precepts of international law, and we're very open and clear about it. But let me be clear, when we can, we work, as you know, incredibly closely with many countries around the world. Many of our strongest allies are represented right here on this panel. But in situations like what happened with Osama bin Laden and others, if in fact the United States feels that it has the ability to deal with a threat, can deal with a threat in a very narrow and a very discreet manner, and can effectively safeguard as a result of an action our people, and frankly I would say the citizens that are represented in this room, we feel that's consistent with international law, and we can think it's consistent with our laws. And those, again, are laws where we have our executive, who must sign the law, our legislature that must pass the law, and our judiciary that must rule on the law, all of which are absolutely independent from one another. And if you take that and you take the transparency with which we deal with these things, including something such as dealing with Osama bin Laden, or even something as controversial as the drone strikes, everyone may not agree with them, but in our system, our National Security Advisor has spoken very publicly and clearly about it and about the rationale, and we permit the world to debate it. And so my view is between the checks and balances and the transparency, and what I would say is consistent with international law, and our attempt to work so closely with our allies, such as those here today, I think those are the ingredients of what we do, and that would be my answer to your first question.
What will be your vision of the balance? Will it be some conventional mechanism updating international conventions where would most of the countries be parties to, or multilateral, bilateral agreements, joint special forces operations? So what is your exact vision of the balance between the rule of law and such efficient operations? I cannot agree more that some situations require a radical and extraordinary interference.
Just to be clear, I'm the head of the criminal division of our Department of Justice. And of course, there's also a national security division, a terrorism division that I am not in charge of, one of my colleagues is. But Mr. Minister, I don't think that there is a tension between rule of law and safeguarding your society. I think they're one and the same. I think my answer before was that I don't think it's inconsistent. I think that our role is that we believe dramatically in the rule of law. We speak about it, we train about it, we deal with our allies with respect to it, and want to have an open dialogue and an open exchange of ideas, and we very much value the role of our friends, and indeed often change our policies because of what our friends ask for. So I don't see national security and such actions and rule of law as being inconsistent. I think they're very consistent. I would say more generally, at least in the world that I'm in, the world of crime, I'll allude to the corruption fight. I do think we feel that in some areas we have been a leader, in other areas others have. But for instance, in the area of bribing foreign officials, just to give an example, we have a law since the 70s, Mr. Minister, after we had our own crisis with our Watergate crisis, and we had a president who had to resign, and we determined that there was too much corruption. There was too much corruption of American companies bribing foreign officials. And it's been a gradual process, but I think we have been a world leader in that effort, and I think as a result of that, many have joined us. And I think that's better. We don't really want to be on our own. We want to be together. We want to work collaboratively. Now, of course, many countries have such statutes. Your own country, of course, has passed an anti-bribery statute, and we applaud you for it. It's that exact same paradigm that I would use in the example you have given. Our preference is always to work with other countries in a multilateral approach. But I guess what I would have to say at the end of it, and we do almost always, but as our President has said, there will be times that I think we, as every nation, will feel that we can act in a moment. We will act unilaterally if we think we must. But we also think in doing so, we're doing it very much consistent with rule of law, consistent with transparency, and consistent with the checks and balances and the separation of powers in our constitutional society.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps someone you would like to say something within the general line of our discussion here, maybe not in response to my questions, but something else as well.
Brief so my other panelists can speak. I guess I tried to weave in the themes that I was going to raise today in the answers to your question. I think ultimately the rule of law blossoms and a society blossoms when there is a balance of power, a separation of powers, and when, for the most part, there's true transparency. And as I alluded to this morning, our cases that we bring in our division, we publicize how we do it, we publicize why we do it. We try to be as transparent as we can, given the norms of the criminal justice system, where at times, of course, you cannot share everything. But I, for one, believe, and our Attorney General believes, and our President believes, that you can both fight for the liberty of individuals, fight for the freedom of expression, the individual right of a person to do what he or she feels they want to do within norms, and also preserving the rule of law, prosecuting crimes, and fighting terrorism. And so that, I think, is the great part of what we're talking about here today, that those don't have to be in tension. You work at it, but they can both blossom together.
Oh, well, thank you, Lenny. Perhaps someone would like to ask a question to Lenny Brewer. Well, unless we have any questions from the audience, please don't be afraid. I don't think that he would somehow bite you, or else. Well, let us hope that we'll have more questions coming later. But now let me give the floor to Thomas Dittmann, Head of Department of Criminal Law of the Ministry of Justice of Germany. Germany is a country known for its scrupulous compliance with the rule of law and the legislative norms, which is very topical and important for Russia as well. And there is also a focus on crime prevention, which has been a traditional focus of the German legal system. Again, a strong tradition to prevent as early as possible any crimes, and also to educate people in the spirit of law abidance. I wonder, what do you think about your current situation in Germany, and do you see any challenge in terms of the balance of power and the rule of law and the new international norms that are appearing? What do you see, or what do you think in Germany about all this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. On behalf of Federal Justice Minister Mrs. Leuthäuser-Schnarrenberger and myself, I would like to thank you for your kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to outline the German position on this subject. Nowadays, not only productivity but also modern conveniences and ultimately our livelihoods are dependent upon a highly technical infrastructure. If there is a breakdown in the electricity supply, we can no longer heat our homes, the railways stop running, in summer refrigeration appliances stop working, and food spoils. If payment transactions are brought to a standstill and all cash machines stop working, the disruptions can be so severe that they may also constitute a threat to our security. What is even more alarming about this already gloomy prospect is that criminals will try to penetrate these systems and take control over them. Where exactly these people then operate from is often a mystery. What is absolutely relevant to security interests, however, is the propaganda and incitement to commit acts of terrorism that can be found on the Internet. An analysis carried out by a German security authority concluded that in Germany, 80% of Islamist criminal offenders who are prepared to use violence are radicalized online. It is the hate preachers and promises on the Internet which, particularly among young people, create a willingness to commit terrible acts as suicide attackers. One thing is certain for us: we can't allow the police to do everything that seems reasonable to them. All the things that police could do in the interests of security frequently involve violations of citizens' rights. A state which could constantly determine and record the whereabouts of each and every one of its citizens through electronic means, which I am sure would be absolutely possible in these days and age, would certainly be in a position to achieve good results in criminal prosecution. However, the price would be that the vast majority of citizens who do not commit a single criminal offense during their entire lives would be monitored at every turn. That is inconceivable for us. Of course, the police must not only be allowed to intercept letters, but also tap telephones and monitor the latest forms of electronic communication. In the German understanding, this should never be organized by the police themselves solely according to the principle of efficiency. Since each such measure results in interference with citizens' rights, there must always be a legal basis. The degree of intrusion into the privacy of our citizens may differ, so we believe that any far-reaching intrusion must be made subject to judicial authorization. Let me just give a short example. The police are naturally permitted to search the car registration database to find out who a specific motor vehicle belongs to. However, if they want to carry out audio surveillance to find out what is being said inside the vehicle, they are required to obtain judicial authorization based on a thorough assessment of the statutory requirements. I don't want to describe the police's individual powers of interference in the privacy of accused persons or even third parties. This would go too far. But I would like to take a brief look at some indispensable rule of law guarantees. Undercover operations are only permitted in exceptional cases. That is, if there is no other way to carry out the investigations effectively. If undercover investigations have been authorized by a judge, all concerned parties must be informed of the measure after it has been taken, but of course once the need for confidentiality no longer exists. In Germany, the rule of law has only been strengthened by the fact that a complaint can still be filed with a higher court against past operations. The principle of proportionality must always be observed. If an investigation measure profoundly interferes with the rights of accused persons or even uninvolved third parties, it may only be carried out if the prosecution of a serious crime is involved. Any form of torture, even threat of torture, is absolutely forbidden. Well, to finish, I like to mention another important thing, the forms of terrorism we face and the most serious types of crime know no borders. On the other hand, the differences between legal systems are exploited by terrorists and criminals when they choose the location of their criminal offenses. We must therefore make all possible efforts to strengthen our international cooperation, particularly as regards the fights against cybercrime. Criminals have long been operating as global players, and we are responsible for the security of our countries and our citizens and must certainly do the same. Part of this is a sharing of technical knowledge in the police side. On behalf of the federal government of the Federal Republic of Germany, I would like to thank our Russian hosts for having provided an excellent forum here for a discussion on how we can make further progress in this area.
Большое спасибо, Thomas.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Are there any questions from the audience? I have a question. What do you think? You, as an expert in criminal law, as an attorney, I understand that, of course, any torture or any physical violence towards a detainee are prohibited. But are there any cases in Germany revealed that really the police did use such methods against some detained people to make them say something or do something?
Well, you probably know there was a case. The vice president of a police organization, a local police organization, told about torture. They did not use torture, but they spoke about torture. And he decided so, missing any legal basis or any, not at all, a judicial decision, because the detainee had kidnapped a child, and nobody knew if the child was still alive. And that was why he said we have to talk about torture. And then the detainee said, well, I take you to the place where we can find the child. But the child was dead already. And, the detainee went even to Strasbourg. He had no success. He was punished for murder lifelong, and then he tried to appeal, and he even went to Strasbourg, and even there he was not successful.
Ну, я спросил в том числе и потому, что
Well, the reason I asked this question is also that in Russia we had a case, unfortunately, many such cases of torture, of using the physical violence against detainees. So I'm interested in the experience of other countries. I used to work in the Prosecutor General's office, and actually back then I was friends with many police officers and prosecutors, and we had many drinks shared between ourselves, so I know a thing or two about the work of the police. And perhaps I have a question to all of you, to all panelists, and to Lenny as well. Indeed, today, in the early 21st century, we sometimes have to use medieval techniques to achieve some result. the police would have their own truth. Police officer would be protecting the interests of many people, including all of us here. But indeed, is it true that the final result, a good, positive result, can be justified by some methods? Thomas, indeed, of course, you gave us a good example. The life of a child is valuable, and even threatening to torture a detainee may perhaps be justified or not justified. I don't know. Now, what do you think about such an approach?
The story doesn't end there, because there's the other thing, what happened with the police person. He was dismissed from his job, and it was clearly said it was absolutely illegal what he tried, what he did. Well, he did not try torture, he just spoke about it. He announced it. That was enough, and in the trial, the detainee confessed everything. And then later, with his appeals, he tried to get a mixture between this torture, and so far he was not successful, but there was no court at all that ever said it was legal what they did. Although on the one hand we had the life of a child, and on the other hand the torture, but there was no doubt in the legal decisions that even in this case he was not allowed to do what he did. And yes, and he gave up his job, and but he found, on the other hand, a job somewhere else. But he's no longer a police person.
Mr. Minister, I agree entirely with Thomas. We don't believe, and I don't believe, there's any role for torture at all whatsoever, without qualifications. Indeed, we prosecute it. In the Department of Justice, we're a big country, and on any given year there will be examples where, unfortunately, we will find police officers who, for one reason or another, have tortured. My colleague who's here, the United States Attorney from New York, who is speaking on some panels, she and I were at Moscow State Law School the other day, and she told of a story when she was a younger prosecutor of a famous case in New York, where New York City police officers went to a bar where there had been a disruption. A police officer had been punched in the face and knocked out. The police mistook and were incorrect in identifying who had punched the officer. They arrested the person, which they were entitled to, and then they proceeded to horribly abuse him. That officer went to trial and received 30 years in jail. So there is no role for torture, and indeed I'm not even convinced, even if there were a role, that you get reliable information. I don't think you do. I think it's an absolutely unreliable technique, but it's also unconstitutional, so I agree very much with my friend.
Well, if I understand correctly, the situation, all panelists agree, at least in that it is not possible to really to repeat such a situation. And it's not about a bad person being hurt, but it's about a temptation to use similar methods against other people, perhaps not that bad as the original criminal, because in the end of the day we may end up with lawlessness and lack of rule of law. And I remember a story from the Great Depression times that the police were so tired of proving the guilt of gangsters in courts. The police decided that they would be better off to shoot those gangsters, and the police just started shooting all those gangsters without bringing them to court. And well, I mean, probably this is a very rough depiction of what was going on in Chicago or elsewhere, but maybe sometimes it was true. I also read quite a few archive documents, and I at least remember how bandits and gangsters were destroyed and eradicated after the Second World War. Back then, such robberies were on the tide, but they used quite criminal and forceful measures to end and stop gangsters, and they did. But I don't think that we would like to have a repetition of that. Any questions? No? Well, perhaps I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jonsson from Iceland. By the way, I remember I liked to read Icelandic sagas, and I was really fascinated by the truth that contained in those texts. They were not inspired by myths, as was the case in the 6th or 7th centuries, and they were not affected by the romanticism of Germany and France of later centuries, but in the 13th or 12th century, I mean, if it was written there, you need to cut off the leg of your enemy, of your opponent. That's the way that you have to really act. Perhaps you can share with us your views, how you think from one of the corners of Europe, maybe with not that many people living there and with not that many crimes hence there. Perhaps what do you think about the problems and challenges that we discussed today?
Refer to the sagas, now we have had 8 or 10 centuries to mature from that time, and what I am interested in is the democratic aspect of this discussion. I am of the opinion that the end never can justify the means, and I am probably an exception in this room that I am not a lawyer, but I've been interested in human rights all my life. I'm a historian, and I was a television and radio journalist for 10 years before I entered politics. I had been the chairman of the Federation of State and Municipal Employees in Iceland, so I have been involved in labor union politics. If it is our conclusion that there is no tension between human rights on the one hand and the rule of law on the other, I think there must be something wrong either with our definition of human rights or our definition of the rule of law, because we don't have to go as far back as the Nixon area in the United States. We only have to look at Guantanamo. We only have to look at Tibet in China, and what Amnesty International says about the plight of labor unions in China and human rights there. And I don't know about the situation in Russia. Probably people could be more critical of what is happening within our own societies. I come from a very small country, Iceland, and we have discovered that we are no exception to the threats a modern society can be faced with, and the threats we can have to other societies, even if we are very small. Thus, the involvement of our newly privatized banking system in international banking, apparently often on the borders of what was legally correct, and sometimes definitely across the borders, not to mention the ethical side, led to a serious financial crash with very serious consequences for the whole of society, the Icelandic society, a few years ago in the fall of 2008. This reminded us that the threats to society are not only military in nature, from organized crime or the physically brutal type, or cyber threats, but have to do with the way we organize and run our societies, the way we set market forces limits by law and regulations, and might I add, the way we set ethical standards, standards which indeed you cannot regulate for, but standards and norms a civilized society must always fight for. This is important for the well-being, stability and security of our society. And then there is one thing I want to mention and emphasize. I think it is important when we discuss threats to countries and societies to remember what societies are made of. A society is a collection of homes and individual persons. A country may be safe and secure, well protected by police and military, while groups and individuals may live in fear, constantly at risk of mental and physical abuse in their own home, at their workplace or elsewhere in society. Here I am, of course, referring to violence against women and children. I maintain that these aspects of life should not be forgotten when we discuss ways and means of creating a safer and more secure world. And this is something that the Council of Europe has been working for in recent years, and we have been trying to contribute for our part. Now, the Ministry of Justice in Iceland is part of the Ministry of Interior, under its umbrella, so to speak, and thereunder we also place human rights. I think police, security and human rights are well placed under the same hat. Now, I'm not going to tire you with reading my text, but I want to tell you that we in recent years have had groups, organized crime coming into our society, and I'm very glad to tell you and share with you the experience how willing and determined society is to shut the doors on these elements. And although this might seem irrelevant and far too small for such a big global conference, I want to tell you a little story. I think it is a symbolic story. After we started our campaign against groups, these groups I am referring to, Hells Angels, outlaws, these people who define themselves as standing outside society, outside law and order. As we started to fight against them, I was once invited as Minister of Justice to the meeting of a motorcycle club. This was a group of honest and decent people. They were all clad in leather with all the emblems on their backs and tattoos. They told me that every summer they organized a trip to the countryside in Iceland. But this time something odd had happened. Whenever they wanted to book hotel accommodation, and they told who they were a motorcycle club traveling around, they were told, no, sorry, everything is fully booked, no rooms available. Of course, they understood that this was society responding to motorcycle criminal gangs, and they were appealing to me as Minister of Justice to come and help them to correct this misunderstanding in society. But I am taking this little story to tell how important it is that society responds to crime. And in continuation, I want to say that it is so important and all important that there is that society and those who are serving us, the police, military, if so be, that they trust each other. This question of social trust. Now, then I have a whole page on cyber threat. I'm not going to say a word about that, but everybody knows what I mean. But I, at the beginning, referred to the economic side of security. I want to tell you that after the economic crash in Iceland, we were all very, or have been all very much aware of those dimensions of security that have to do with social and economic stability. The privatization of core services in society can, in the end, pose a threat to society. If I am correct, Los Angeles was spared from the Enron scandal because Los Angeles, that good city, still controlled the electricity services in Los Angeles, not Enron. We have now, after the economic crash in Iceland, found the cold breath of speculators, international speculators, mostly on the economic kind, but also the political kind, wanting to buy up vital services and getting a foothold. Apparently this is a common experience of nations going through economic difficulties. I think this is one side of the security a nation must face up to. I think it is good to come together and share experiences, hopefully to learn from them and thus be better prepared to enhance the goal of making the world a better place to live in, more just, and consequently more secure.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. I wonder if there are any questions to ask the Minister. Probably questions will come later. Our distinguished neighbor on my right, Lord Chancellor Kenneth Clark, who represents a nation which is associated with the supremacy of jurisprudence. And I can recall how I was shocked by the ordinary hearings in Hampton Court, not by the subject matter of the proceedings, but the environment, the quality of hearings guided by the judge and under the judge's dominant role. However, all parties to the process had a fair chance to speak, and everything was done to arrive at the truth. And I was really shocked hearing those riots, about those riots last August, and given the fact that not some outcasts were involved, but the entire category of youth and other people and interests they pursued were not just the greed and looting, yes. They broke into stores, well, they took some gadgets which they could very well afford to buy. But that, I think, was the state of their mental sets. That's, you know, the atmosphere and environment when they feel like dominating over the system. We observed similar cases before, but it's not only the question that I'm going to ask Mr. Clark. And Britain is well known and with the justice before truth principle. It's a controversy to what we discussed before, and so that truth may not be achieved, arrived at. However, those criminal is not accused, but the procedure is followed. At some point, we believe that was to be too orthodoxy, but on the other hand, the UK made it quite known by the ability of coexistence of two systems within one, and that's the common law and the equity law, when one law complemented the other and enabled the other to be more flexible and more efficient. So you are are a great lawyer, you're a great bureaucrat in the good sense of the word. What do you think can be done today in order to introduce positive changes so that things become more flexible and complement each other under the umbrella of the rule of law? Thank you.
Yes, well, the question, you suddenly moved on from where your first question, and I think the problem of the riot, how we deal with the problem of the criminal underclass we have, and very surprising and rather shocking lawlessness is somewhat wider than just the law. I think it has a great deal to do with the reforms we're embarked upon of our education system, the reforms we're embarked upon of our sentencing system. It is not true that the people who took part in the riots were typical young people, and it's not true that on this occasion the riots had very much to do with social or political issues which riots in cities we had 20 years before did. But on this occasion, 80% of these people had previous criminal convictions, and most of them had been through the criminal justice system several times before, and it was largely looting of designer goods being targeted by the people who were taking part. It was lawlessness. Now, apart from prosecuting and punishing those people, I think British society has to ask itself, why does it have an apparently growing number of young people who are totally alienated from the ordinary norms of family life in the United Kingdom? Hence, as I say, I'm not going to make a long speech. You have to talk about our education system, our family structure and what we do to support it, also about our sentencing policy. Our prisons are overcrowded and they're just universities of crime, and 50% of the prisoners will commit another crime within 12 months of being released, however long you make the sentence. And our way of dealing with young people is not good enough. And so we are trying to concentrate much more on the punishment of criminals, but the reformative aspect of punishment as well, concentrating on things which combine punishment with work opportunities, training, tackling drug abuse, tackling alcohol abuse, giving some mentoring to those that show a willingness to reform when they leave prison. We must improve the reoffending rate of those who go through the system, rather than just lock them up, push them out, and then find we're surprised when they take part in a riot a short time after they've been released. So it's a different subject. On the rule of law, we don't compromise on the rule of law. Our armed forces, our police, all aspects of our criminal justice system are totally subject to the law. They have no immunity from prosecution. They're not able to acquire any immunity from prosecution. Our armed forces will not take part in military action which is contrary to the law. And indeed they wish to be reassured when ordered to take part in military conflict that what they are doing is lawful. We would not allow them to plead in defence that they were only obeying orders or the instructions of a minister. This has been very controversial for 10 years, because the question you asked goes to the heart of it. We have the politics of fear as well. And the fear of terrorism makes people tempted to do all kinds of things which are not quite legal. I'm glad to say, so far we have resisted that. The Iraq War, our Attorney General, then Attorney General, changed his opinion. It was, in my opinion, obviously illegal, also politically very unwise as well. But the Attorney General changed his opinion and said it was lawful. And there we are. That's where we remain. We recently took part with the French in supporting the civilian population in an insurrection in Libya. And actually we were scrupulous, and it was our armed forces insisted we were scrupulous in behaving lawfully. We obeyed the United Nations resolution. Our Attorney General sat in the little ministerial group directing the day-to-day operations. The resolution authorised us to protect the civilian population from attack by Libyan armed forces, and we were going in for aerial raids to do so. But at every stage, and actually the Cabinet, which I'm a member, we did discuss making sure we were not repeating what, I'm sorry, in my partisan opinion, the previous government had done, which is stepping over the line into ordering our armed forces to do something which was not lawful in international law. Similarly, with the police, the police have no authority to do anything unlawful. We don't get allegations of torture, but our police are not perfect. We do get allegations of violence to people they arrest. We get allegations, quite troubling ones, of racialism, racial abuse, sometimes racial violence against suspects. British public opinion, as well as the law, gets very excited about these. They do get investigated, and people are dismissed and they are prosecuted. We do not tolerate that in any circumstances, and nor, I think, are we going to do so. We have big complaints sometimes. We have a lot of complaints at the moment about our intelligence services. We have a lot of complaints about our police service, who are accused by some people, radical groups, but others, suspects, terrorist suspects, having abused them, having taken part in unlawful rendition, having taken part in abuse and handing them over to third-party countries where they will be tortured and all this kind of thing. It's big politics in Britain. We are having big public inquiries. Judges are tortuously going over the evidence, inquiring into all this. The argument, we have not yet succumbed to the argument that the terrorist risk is so great that you have to let your agencies and your police do what they have to do and pretend you haven't noticed. And actually, in each case, before the judge can start the inquiry and start investigating the outfit, we first of all let the police investigations go first. And if the police can get enough evidence to prosecute, that will take priority. It's only when the police come to the conclusion there is no prosecution that can be brought that the judge will get underway with the inquiry. It's all on the principle, I may quote Benjamin Franklin, probably not totally, actually, great American Benjamin Franklin. Any country which gives up an ounce of its fundamental freedom for the sake of its safety deserves neither freedom nor safety. As our Icelandic friend said, the end does not justify the means. And that's where we stick. But it's difficult sometimes. And there are sections of public opinion who think that's all rather squeamish. And there's plenty of people who tell them they'll be murdered in their beds if we continue to respect these things. But I don't personally think the British Parliament is going to give way on that in the foreseeable future. Now, there are difficulties. We eavesdrop. Organised crime, you can't have any organised crime being better organised than your police force. So we intercept. To intercept, you need ministerial approval in our case, not judicial. But no policeman was able to start intercepting the telephone. My colleague is about to have the most enormous political row because we need to collect data on who people are telephoning. And for some years, actually, we've made the telephone companies keep data. So, actually, if they wanted to, they could find out who I have been telephoning in the last 12 months. But they can't listen to the phone call. They can be told that there's a man in Chicago I have been telephoning twice a week for the last 6 months. If they want to listen to my phone calls to Chicago, you have to go to the Secretary of State, and not this one, the other one, who will authorise it. But she will be in trouble if there's no legal ground, no adequate suspicion to justify authorising the interception. Now, we're trying to extend that now to emails and Twitter and Facebook, and I can only say that I'm glad to say it's not my piece of the legislation. My colleague is going to have the most monumental parliamentary row. I think she's right, because she points out we've done it for telephones. This is merely technology. It's not a change of principle, but a tremendous fight is going on about whether it should be allowed. And so every time if the British start giving into fear and start encroaching on these principles, I'm glad to say there are still quite enough people in Parliament to argue about it. The last government got carried away by terrorism, and of course there are people you can't prosecute because you're evidence against them, your terrorists, has been got by evidence that you can't disclose in court, because it's normally informers or eavesdropping or something of that kind, and you don't want to disclose your intelligence. They try to waive all kinds of rules. We had imprisonment by ministerial edict called control orders. They tried to have people arrested for 90 days without trial. I was then in opposition, in a happy position, not even being a shadow minister, so I was freelance. But of course, on paper they had a majority. I'm glad to say they kept losing vote. They could not get this through Parliament. They kept being defeated. It all had to be watered down. My own party, of which I was not then a leading member, and it was an ex-minister, but I was no longer on the front bench, kept supporting them, but it didn't matter. Parliament would not pass it. And it will happen again. And you do the terrorism, if you're defending the values, which I think we must defend against very dangerous, evil people who are using terrorism, you don't defend it very effectively if you abandon those values in order to defend your society. And I also think if you wish to have more jihadis, and if you wish to act as a recruiting sergeant for the extremists, then start attacking Muslim countries illegally. Start interning people without trial. Start torturing them when you're worried. That is the way you will recruit young Muslims throughout the Middle East to join extremist organizations, because these mad extremists tell them this is Western infidels engaged in persecuting our religion and our society. And if they see us abandon our normal values in order to actually attack Muslim enemies of whom we're frightened, you may get rid of the terrorist in the first place. You may kill him with your bomb and probably half the village at the same time, but you have recruited another 10 as you go about it in that particular way. So you may gather I'm rather a vehement supporter of the rule of law, and I'm glad to say that continues to be the majority position under whatever government's in power in the United Kingdom.
Большое спасибо,
Well, thank you, Mr. Clark. I know that you are in a hurry, but one more question. One more question.
Vote for Kenneth Clark.
I'm afraid you'd find some Conservatives in Britain might not totally agree with you. So far, we're holding it up.
Да, но господин Кларк сказал, что он...
Well, Mr. Clark said that he is not sure that all his party members or friends agree with him, but still. I have one more question to you, Mr. Clark, whether you think it is feasible or correct in the current situation, by analogy with the rule of justice, with common law, or by analogy with Praetorius law in the Roman law, whether it is possible to set up a code of laws for today to make sure that we can promptly react to new challenges and threats like lawlessness and organized crime and terrorism and others.
Well, one thing I'm strongly in favour of is international cooperation in doing so. Indeed, I think it's quite essential. So, historically, we had Interpol, which used to cooperate. But actually, we've gone far beyond that. And across the European Union, having one arrest warrant, having the ability to exchange data with each other, actually having accurate access to criminal records, actually cooperating, I will agree, we were very much in favour of cooperating with the Americans on passenger name records when it came to people getting onto flights. That has been agreed, finally, in the European Union. I said that we mustn't, the rule of law does not require that we remain less well organised, so far as policing and the courts are concerned, than organised criminals. I mean, that is absurd. So I personally am all in favour of having close working, close linking, and that does involve, obviously, in order to work closely together, that the policing systems all have to have pretty common standards of what it is they're going to do in assembling the information and what is legitimate and not legitimate to do. We've gone quite a long way on that, and it's, I think it's inevitable we're going to have to do so. And you know, as you've been doing today in your forum, it's important to the business, financial, commercial world and the whole business of getting corruption out of trade and so on, just as it is on terrorism and old-fashioned organised crime. There are still plenty of organised international criminals, particularly in the world of drug smuggling and other forms of quite straightforward robbery, organised on a very skillful international level sometimes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Clark. Indeed, we thank you for taking part in this forum and in this roundtable discussion. It was an honor for us to see you here. Thank you. I would suggest that we can summarize a little bit what we heard during the last two presentations. I think it is important what we heard. At least to me, it was a quasi-revelation, perhaps, because I had similar ideas, but it was during the last two presentations that I realized what they are. Now, what Mr. Jonas told us, he gave us a very good example how society can oppose crime. And what Mr. Clark later said, that on the one hand, society can support the idea of preventing crime by innovative means, for example, through, say, monitoring social networks, perhaps, to make sure that we can prosecute criminals. But on the other hand, the basis, the fundamentals of such crime was not affiliation to something, what is going on in the country. It was not the idea that this country lives for you, for your interests. And I think that here we can draw a conclusion as part of our discussion, in that many new issues in posing new threats and challenges can be better resolved based on public accord. In the event that civil society is responsible, is mature, and can really combat and oppose some negative elements within itself. Hence, we can resolve other issues, any limitations on the freedom of travel, on the freedom of expression, etc. But this can only be done when the majority of the public in the country would think of such limitations as about self-limitations, when they would really be constrained in such behavior. It's also important to prevent any distancing between the individual and society and the country. People should think about themselves as involved, as engaged into the country. So we can here perhaps act in a more simple way, trying to gain some immediate result through military operations against this or that regime. But here I agree with Kenneth in that well, we can kill terrorists, but killing them on a scale would indeed lead to the same mythical Hydra, where you would cut off one hand and would have many more growing out of it. Now, when we're trying to resolve the challenge of regions or whole countries that do not fit our civilizational paradigm, and we try to resolve this problem by bombing that country, by encircling that country with the UN troops, etc. Well, indeed, even then, this is only a temporary solution, because we can expect even a larger conflict on our hands later. So perhaps we need to think how we can not only prevent some negative trends in individual regions of the world or individual countries, but we need to think how we can pull out those countries of this negative paradigm to prevent any future new challenges. Perhaps I'm wrong, and I would appreciate your comments on that, but again, this is one of the conclusions that we can probably draw. We need to be involved in opposing threats to their security, and we need also to demonstrate that society can really be mature when it fights organized crime and other threats to security in a concerted way. It is my pleasure to give the floor now to Mr. Kirill Navamura, from an outstanding lawyer. And indeed, I have quite a few questions to him. Perhaps based on his personal experience, he has quite a lot to say on that. But in particular, I wonder how you view the challenge of the security of the individual on the one hand, and against the backgrounds of the persisting power of the state, and on the other hand, we see also the influence and the effects of some marginal, illegal formations and groups. What could be the role of the lawyer to protect the individual in this situation when we have infringement on the security and safety of the individual, on the private life of the individual from the state and from some illegal groups? But also, what do you think about the body of proof? Indeed, we need to collect some proof and evidence to try to disclose new, very complex forms of organized crime. For example, what do you think about monitoring social networks where information can serve as the basis for a court decision?
Mr. Minister, many questions to me. I am presently the president of International Bar Association. In such position, I represent 4,500,000 lawyers all over the world. But I'm just a business lawyer, and I'm not a criminal lawyer. I'm not a social media expert, so perhaps I'm a wrong person to respond to your questions. But let me say something about my thoughts. The very strong power of present-day nation, government, must be justified absolute justice. The government must stand on the justice. Without justice, whether the government may achieve its objective or not, it's wrong. And so due process is very, very important. We must confess that the Japan was not, and maybe is not, may not be yet a completely perfect, successful, due process, human rights nation yet. we are on the process to improve and build up a very good justice system to enforce very strong power, including death penalty. We still have a death penalty, which is very strongly supported by the people. And so the government must be very much justice. And we have a recently very interesting cases in Japan. The very well-known politician and a very strong bureaucrat, both separately prosecuted, and very difficult court cases. But in the process, it was revealed that the evidence were obtained by unfair, harsh interrogation. No torture, no violence, but it was questioned very, very unfairly. And the court dismissed the statement submitted on that basis, and both high, very well-known politician and the very high-rank officials were both declared not guilty. And to that extent, the Japanese defense system functioned well, and we confirmed that the due process of a witness questioning must be respected, is respected under the Japanese legal system.
Сообщено, что имеет свыше 800 миллионов активных пользователей по всему миру.
200 billion of added just in the past 1 year. Twitter had more than 178 million users. Big number. 800 million users means about 12 or 13% of whole human beings living on the earth, on the globe nowadays. So probably the country like ours, yours, nearly 30% of the people are using Facebook. And the power of social media is very strong. But so far in Japan, we do not have a tsunami type of media problems are not taking place yet. And we had a problem of uncertain, wrong media informations at the time of a big earthquake, a 3/11. At that time, as you know, the nuclear plants had the difficulty, and it was disastrous, desperate situation that we could not see accurately what was going on. Under that situation, Facebook, social media social medias were very effective. And we found that the proper disclosures of the facts to the people is the best way to protect a wrong, misleading, the bad news spread through the Facebook. So the good answer is good disclosure by the government to the people. That is the best way to prevent a miserable problem, or to prevent the problem like Arab Springs taking place in our countries. Mr. Minister, could that be a comment responding to your questions?
Well, certainly, you even went somewhat behind the framework of the question and raised even deeper aspects of those challenges that are at issue. I wonder if there are any questions to ask Mr. Kamamura. I think all questions will come later. I would like to point out that, or rather, I would like to emphasize the points Mr. Kawamura said about social media, and it may be related to the self-organization of the people. I think that the internet and the content that is generated and created by users, interactive networks, is kind of terra incognita, and it's a great area of new culture that is not comprehended by us so far. And but future belongs to that. Although sometimes we can find positive and negative things there, when violence propaganda is there. Riots are arranged with the help of social media. Cyber crime, those are the bad features about the internet, but even more problematic today, and something that creates a positive environment for internet crime is the lack of self-organization and self-restriction in shaping some corporate standards of responsibility. I'm making that point is because it is necessarily impossible to regulate the internet. Although we have some examples of legal systems where they deal with that, and some 30,000 policemen are online on a daily basis trying to suppress all negative things or suppress some dissidents and threats. That is just one of the examples that can be assessed, but it's not the fact that it's the most promising area. However, what is absolutely true is that social media, internet, is evolving as a new area, and it should not stay terra incognita for quite long. And sooner or later it is to be subjected to self-regulation, and I hope that there will be prospects that it will be safe and no threats will come from the internet. But it will depend on the responsibility of the people, those who browse through the internet and who are online. It's a matter of time, but I don't want it to be too long. Dear colleagues, having said that, I'm turning the floor to our last speaker, last but not least. And I'm happy that this speaker is my counterpart from Ukraine, Mr. Alexander Vladimir Lavrinovich, the Minister of Justice of Ukraine. So you, Kiev, Russia started from your place, and it's our common history, but still you have a great responsibility and an honor to sum up all our discussions with your view from the Kiev, Russia. Thank you very much for such a historic background, and I think that if we revisit the history of understanding of correlation between the right of a human being, the right of groups or societies, and who are united by religion or ethnic group or by a nation, we will always find a number of levels of understanding to what extent we can use the primacy of human rights over the rights of a religious group, and the rights of the people which may prevail over the interests of a nation or a state. I don't think that somebody may find a clear-cut answer to all those questions, and something that we've been witnessing for many years, and then the search of how to make the world safer. To my regret, I can state that so far we have failed to find such frameworks or machinery, and those that are in place are not efficient enough. It's true that we've made a lot of progress in regulatory things and legislative work. We have a number of regulations enable us to protect human rights and at the same time to build an efficient and effective system to counter violence in various aspects. But you can understand that it's not a decision that fits all. We have a big question about the institutionalizing, both domestically and internationally. Today, many countries in their constitution laws, they have a recognition of the rule of law and its application even in courts, as it is the case in Ukraine. I wonder if it guarantees the adherence to that principle all the time. How it can be understood and interpreted by institutions, domestic institutions. And my answer is that in my country it's not always the case, and it's not only natural rights of people, but those that were acquired as civilization evolved, they are not equally protected, and we should really see how to do that. We can say today that we have that in terms of international cooperation and countering terrorism, countering xenophobia, and those phenomena that can be viewed as a system that since the past century until today has been a separate phenomenon of a global scale. We have most efficient platform for the nations to talk. That's the United Nations and the Security Council. One can understand that there are some individual international institutions or associations that can actively share information and joint efforts to counter crime by observing the human rights at the same time. Interpol can be very well one of the institutions that maintaining the human rights primacy may demonstrate good results in prosecution of those who have breached the law. We have examples of joint anti-terrorist centers giving good results. There are intentions that are to join hands to prosecute criminals not only in national jurisdictions but internationally. There is a very important institutions of the European Human Rights Court, which very quickly won the trust and confidence of the European nations, and but unfortunately very soon it encountered a number of challenges as well. And Mr. Clark already made that point, saying that there is a big challenge how to ensure that the functioning of that institution is really efficient, so that the reasonable terms notion would apply to the court itself. And then that is the problem of processing heaps of claims and applications, how to filter those things, and how to ensure that the address to the Greater Chamber is reached, how the office of the court would function properly, how not to corrupt the Rule 39 of the court application, which may really make some damage to that institution. We relied great hopes on the establishment of the International Court, and we had a chance to discuss things at the anniversary of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and I understand that given the current situation, if all members of the Security Council, those are the countries who are responsible for order in the planet and for peace, should they assume that function, realizing that they have all the means to have an impact and to influence the situation in any part of the world. So if they are not members of that court, the efficiency and effectiveness of that institution will be under doubt. Should it not happen, we will again stay in the middle of the road. I mean that we will still have a possibility of a political will, and so choosing between political willingness and legal forms, we will prefer the former, and even the multiply of that reaction may really compromise all the outcomes, and it will be clear some years later. I'm not going to refer to a lot of cases or armed conflicts which we had in number of 1500 since the end of World War II, and it means that you cannot fight a burnt match by cutting a hand. It will again lead to a fire. That's specifically the view from Kiev, Russia. Because in those old times, the notion of justice was more clear, and people responsible for that showed more responsibility, really. And there were clear priorities. However, those times are history, but we still have some cultural heritage we should take advantage of, and even in today's event, and there were times when there was no notion of the rule of law at all, and still there were some efforts that we can regard now as positive. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Any questions to ask Alexander Vladimirovich? Speaking of the Kiev, Russia law, I'm very fond of that. It was very clear-cut. If a person is accused of something, he was tied up and thrown into a river. If you are drowned, then you are really a criminal. If you survive, you are innocent. Okay, and we still have very much legacy of those times in various formats. I think on that optimistic note, we have completed presentations, and I'm ready to open the floor for discussions, for questions. I don't think that it's common that several justice ministers sit before you, and as well as the assistant of the Attorney General of the United States, and ask them sometimes sensitive questions. So you're welcome. I'm Sergei Andreev, and I would like to ask Mr. Akira Kamamura. I've heard a lot of Japanese culture, and the conclusion is that the self-conscious of the people is the first means to oppose global crime. So my question is very simple. How do you bring up the youth so that they soak in all those cultural habits and traditions? And as a follow-up, probably we should not toughen sanctions for some crimes, but to upbring people from the very beginning to be more conscious, to be more obedient.
Raise many very difficult questions to answer. That's not probably the matter of law, but a matter of education. And I'm not a specialist to compare the Japanese educational system with the other part of the world. But my feeling is the Japanese children are taken care too well by their family, not by the society or not by the school. And so family relationship is very close, and the very good children who listen to the instruction or opinion of their parents or their supervisors. And that makes a relatively peaceful environment of the Japanese society. And the people are very patient, even under the situation like a tsunami or earthquake. That's a fact I could answer to you.
Thank you. Well, I understand that even dogs actually help each other in the streets in difficult times. We all saw the footage when during the tragedy in Japan, even domestic animals behave themselves quite well. By the way, in the question that was asked, there was an interesting nuance about punishment. What do we do about it? And Mr. Clark also spoke about this. I think it's quite simple. You can require many years of prison term to those who committed a crime and or who we consider to be dangerous. I mean, if you ask any person in the street of this city, or in London, or in Tokyo, or in Shanghai, Los Angeles, or any other major city, when you ask a question about an abstract criminal, how do you treat such a criminal? I mean, they would tell you, give him as many years in prison as possible so that society wouldn't deal with this criminal anymore. But there are two additional questions here. Now, if you specify the question, and if you say, what do you do about your close relative, then that person would say quite differently. I mean, he would claim, or he or she would claim, say that you need to really study well whether this whether my relative is really guilty, and you'd need to do anything to really have for him a mild punishment, etc. Well, of course, it's a simple way to send criminals behind bars, but this way we just delay and procrastinate the negative effects of any future behavior of this criminal and of the people of his like. And this is something that we have to face today. The penitentiary reform in Russia is facing a similar challenge, and Mr. Clark is trying to resolve the same challenge of reducing the number of convicts in prison to no more than 80,000 people. I understand that similar efforts are taken in Iceland, where prisons are actually overfilled and people have to wait in queue to get to prison to serve their term. Well, the society is quite tolerant there. Now we have this alienation problem, I'd say, by demonstrating some unjustified cruelty to the criminals, unjustified toughness to such criminals, and really using only force, and the desire to put such criminals in prisons. We thus generate alienation, and they will actually have their comeback in a way that we will have to pay dearly for such a comeback. Thank you. Minister, my name is Sergei Yakovlev. I'm in charge of the investigation departments of the Federal Anti-Drug Committee. I have a question to Leni. We're working with my colleagues and also with our counterparts in the US, and we were discussing a well-known challenge and a problem, talking about the activities of the so-called drug courts, courts that are quite active in the US and in a number of other countries. We were thinking about the way such institutions can operate in Russia, and I understand that, Leni, you know how they work, and this is one of the know-hows that can be shared. I actually asked my counterparts, what do you think about the principle of justice and equality before the law? Because the principle of the drug court is that a person who committed a crime related to drugs would not be punished, but would rather be treated. And a person who is not really associated with this drug trade would sometimes be punished to the full extent. Well, I mean, I couldn't understand this dilemma, and I have still no solution to this dilemma. Perhaps you can provide it to us. Thank you.
So, obviously,
microphone, please.
the drug trade has been and remains for decades an enormous problem in the United States. We continue to be a drug consumer nation, and that results in terrible addictions, terrible violence, the support of drug cartels, whether in Mexico or other countries. And it's clearly an issue that has to have a comprehensive answer, a comprehensive response. And to follow up on some of the themes we heard today, we need to better educate our citizens and our youth. We have to have better drug rehabilitation programs in our prisons and outside of our prisons to get people away from this insidious problems. But with respect to the drug courts, which you've asked for, those tend to be our local and state courts. They tend to be in areas of the country that have most significant drug problems. And they tend, when they work the best, to be a very efficient and a very thoughtful way of dealing with this dilemma. The hope is that the judges on the drug courts have the most sophisticated understanding of the problems of addiction, have the best sense of understanding the plight of a defendant, but also, candidly, have the best way of efficiently resolving a case. And so if we can make the case go quicker, if we can get a faster resolution, a more fair resolution, and a better treatment program, then that's the goal of the drug court. It's also the goal of the drug court that if a really bad defendant comes in, a major drug dealer, that can be identified more quickly and the resolution can be more appropriate to the crime. The problem we're facing right now, candidly, with our budget crisis is that our budgets are being cut. And when our budgets are being cut, our rehabilitation programs are being cut. Our rehabilitation programs are being cut in our prisons, which is a terrible thing. So we have prisoners go to jail. We too have overcrowding in our prisons. We have a very, very high percentage of our population, too high, particularly in our state prisons, but we just have an overpopulated prison population. And we as a country, our challenge has to be to come up, in my mind, with a more comprehensive solution. We have to look hard at the sentences that we impose on defendants. We have to look hard on whether some of those sentences are too high and whether they're rehabilitative alternatives, because right now what's happening is a greater percentage of our budget, our Department of Justice budget, is being spent on our prisons. So we are spending a lot of our time incarcerating people, and as a result we're having fewer prosecutors and we're having fewer investigators. Ideally, we want more prosecutors, we want more investigators, our citizenry will be safer, we want more rehabilitative programs. Our Attorney General is very committed to that, and we want to reduce our prison population. That's the more global goal, but the goal of the drug courts is to, as efficiently as possible, mete out an appropriate sentence, and it's done by judges and often prosecutors who are most expert in that area.
Are you satisfied with the answer? No, I'm not sure what you think, but really, in American justice, there are many unusual aspects from our point of view. With Lenny and with his boss, Mr. Holder, in February in D.C., we discussed cruelty which was used towards some of the children who were adopted from Russia, and I was surprised really to hear that it is the practice of the American courts that if the similar criminal abuse was used against children and adults, the more severe punishment would go to whom? To those who actually demonstrated cruelty towards adults, not towards children, which is unusual to us. Well, because life would be the best judge in this case, who is right and who is wrong.
What the Attorney General said in our very productive meeting, where we tried to be very open, is that the challenges that we have in cases against children is that often there aren't very good witnesses. The children sometimes are unreliable witnesses, and so the law does not make it less of a crime if you hurt a child. Indeed, if anything, the law makes it a greater crime. But the reality of the system in an adversary system is that at times, sadly, crimes against children, those who perpetrate them get away, because if you don't have adequate witnesses. I, as a young prosecutor, prosecuted those cases. I prosecuted abuse of children as one of the cases, and I was a very dogged prosecutor, but the challenges sometimes were enormous. I think that was our point of our Attorney General, and as you know, Mr. Minister, we're very committed to that, as we are very committed to the issue that you raised among the Russian adopted children.
Ну, то есть речь идет о том, как это бывает и в российских судах, что наказать хотя бы так.
Well, as it happens in Russian courts, I mean, you would want to send the one who did the crime, the criminal, into prison, even if he's not probably too much guilty. Mr. Johnson, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, 4 points. On this last one of children not being reliable witnesses, I think it's our task to create conditions where they become reliable witnesses, and this new method that has been developed in Iceland and other countries, I think we were among the first to create certain so-called children's houses where you created the conditions for the child become a reliable witness. Now, I said 4 points. The second is on crime and punishment. And this, of course, is the correct place to discuss the philosophical and practical sides to crime and punishment. Petersburg of Dostoevsky. I think one interesting thing in recent developments in Europe and probably in the United States as well, probably you were before us, of confiscating illegal gains, for instance in the drug traffic. I think this is the future. This is much more effective, or I find it very convincing when lawyers and legal experts advocate this, that confiscating the gains of illegal activities is probably more effective than the actual imprisonment of people. Now, the third point I wanted to make has to do with this question of monitoring social networks, which I think is very, very important to discuss in great depth. And I am very worried about what Kenneth Clarke, the British Attorney General, told us here, although I quite admire and am in agreement with his basic views, because he's an advocate of capitalism with a human face, as Edward Heath was in former days. And, but this question of monitoring all telephone calls and internet activities, I find this frightening. And I think that we should be very careful when we step into this arena. Instead of monitoring people, you could of course say, if you are an honest person, what do you have to fear? Why not monitor all your actions, all your movements, everything? But when you do that, you step into an authoritarian state, I fear. I think instead we should say, you should be free and not monitor until you step into the world of human trafficking or drugs or something like that, which is a different approach. And my fourth point is related to that, because I was reading the speeches of Pericles from 2,500 years ago in the Peloponnesian Wars described by Thucydides. And he was comparing the systems of Sparta, which was authoritarian, and Athens, which was democratic. And he said that the Spartans did not have to teach people courage, and they didn't need to have any military or other secrets, because the Athenians defended their state not because they were taught to do so, because they wanted to do it. And this is why I think it is so important, instead of stepping into these monitoring authoritarian positions, that we should be always in all our workings and all our thinkings democratic. It must come from inside, not from outside, our longing to defend our democratic rights and our democratic societies.
Well, thank you very much. I understand that we're still talking about properly balanced engagement of as many members of society as possible into protecting commonly shared values. Also, my views about social networks. The thing is not to really teach all or most of members of society, as in the Orwell's quite a scary utopia. It is not about teaching and making people behave. We're talking about different formats, collective or individual, and one of those formats of communications and means of communication is the internet. But unfortunately, we're talking today about the crowd effect, and what happened in London, what Clarke was talking about, actually is another side of the story, when people are simply drawn into the aggressive behavior of others, like fans in football arenas, like those who are involved in pogroms and destruction. These are all the examples of people trying to be valuable, but they are also easily dissolved in the destructive behavior of the crowd. And hence there's another question: how to oppose such destructive moods, how to establish such trends and benchmarks and motivation that would really destruct this destructive behavior, and the role model would be responsible and diligent behavior of people. I think you raised your hand and wanted to ask a question, please.
I have the following question. The history of the Russian state is quite long, and the Russian state have passed away from feudalism to monarchy and to communism, and in the past 20 years we've been a democracy. The panel represents the countries that gradually evolved from one phase to another, and the Russian police also changed according to the historical phases. We had the Soviet militia. In the 20 past years we had Russian militia. Now it is the Russian police. The fact is that the Russian population are afraid of the police, and they do not trust that system. One political analyst was saying that if salaries and wages were raised for the policemen, and they would change their attitude to the Russian environment, Russian citizens, but it didn't happen. Their salaries and wages were raised, but violence didn't stop. And people are still afraid of the policemen. If you are asked for advice, what would you say? What is to be done so that that situation can be changed? Who can take that question?
Well, I'm willing to with my friend.
Well, I think to have the balance, we need control of police and investigators, and of course it's up to the judges to control them, and of course the bosses, but I think to control the system you need the rights of the defense counsels. They must have access to any evidence that was raised when the investigations are finished. During the investigations they may have what they can have, not to disturb the investigations, but when the investigations are finished, the defense counsel has to have access to any data, anything that was found out by the police. And in accordance to that, you need in the proceedings access of the press. Maybe there are some cases concerning the state security aspire cases where the press can be held out, but regularly the press must have access to the proceedings to give the public the opportunity to have a view on what is done there. That's the German opinion.
What I would say is it has to be a comprehensive approach. In our country, we too have had police that citizens feared. We've had communities that feared police. African Americans for for generations in our society and in many parts of our country have feared police, and right now there's a very famous case going on in Florida, and I think an African-American young man would say that he might act differently in public doing nothing wrong than my own children who are teenagers might do. And so how do you deal with that? In my mind, you deal with it various ways. One is exactly what you have said. You want your police, you want your first responders to earn an appropriate wage, a true middle-class wage. You want it to be a profession, a job that is sought after. Two, you want to expand the groups of people. So we have tried very hard in our country to have all groups be a part of it. So today, many of the groups that historically might have been the subject of abuse now themselves are police officers. Third, I think it's incumbent on prosecutors in the government to aggressively prosecute police misconduct. Fourth, I think you need the light of day. You have to fight corruption. In the same way that we go after high-level corruption, you have to go after low-level corruption. You have to either fire the police officers, sanction the police officers, prosecute them if there's corruption. So you have to do it. In a tragic case, in our Katrina, during the Katrina terrible devastation, hurricane in New Orleans, we had a terrible case of police officers who with guns shot and killed a number of African Americans during the melee, during their fear, and these were innocent people. And we've spent the better part of the last 6 years prosecuting every one of them, and the message has to be no one is above the law, everyone must abide by the law. And so what we do is we try in every way we can to train police officers, to make them feel a part of the community. And without being too sensitive, we even have a program in Washington where we have the Holocaust Museum. And we bring police officers from all over the country to the museum to give an example of what happens when the police are on the wrong side, when police aren't feeling their job is to protect the citizenry, but rather they think their job is to take advantage of the citizenry or to do worse. So it's got to be a comprehensive approach, and it'll take some time, I suspect.
Yes, I think your question is very important, and I think it should be taken very seriously. And I think it is very important that it should be raised as often as possible, because the question is who monitors the monitors. I was referring to the work of the Council of Europe on child abuse, and I attended a conference in Rome in the fall of 2011 on child abuse, and there was a young boy who had been a Frenchman who had been abused in his early youth by his stepfather, and he had reached out his hand towards the police, court system, to society, and nobody took it. And he said this was more difficult for me than going through the actual proceedings that followed once finally took his hand. And he said things have changed in recent years now in France, although it's going very slowly, and this is the same, I suppose, everywhere. And this conference, organized by the Council of Europe, and further conferences that have been in the wake of this, and then conventions that the Council of Europe states have signed, are working towards changing this. In Iceland, we have, apart from the big distrust in politicians, who are very, very low, but distrust in certain aspects of the court and police system. And this has primarily to do with women and violence against women. Women, surveys show, distrust the system so much that they do not take rape cases to court because of distrust. So I say that the answer is discussion, openness, discussion. And what we have tried to do, and what I have tried to do since I became Minister of Justice, is to called for this discussion, and we've organized the conferences, open conferences with the police, grassroots organizations, people from the courts, lawyers, to take this up and try to uproot this and change the situation. Discussion, openness, I think is the answer.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. And if I may, to make my contribution, then first, I take your question also very positively. It is to be openly said. It is to be monitored. My only reservation is that on the one hand, we should really encourage changes as fast as possible, but on the other hand, we should also realize that transition is a must. You cannot expect that things will change radically in 2 or 3 years. Those things that had been taking shape for decades cannot be changed overnight. And even 8 years ago, I lived in this city. I was also afraid of police, although I'm not an Afro-American, and I was carrying an idea of Deputy Prosecutor General of the city, but I was not safe at night. So, responding to your point, that's the only case when I fully agree with Lenny. I cannot agree more that there is a comprehensive approach that can only help. Wages and salaries can be raised, and we can also study the experience of our German counterparts on life, employment. We should establish serious oversight and supervision over the police system, and we have to focus on middle class and civil society. Minister Nurgaliev once said that Russian policemen, they didn't come from moon. It resulted in a number heaps of laughter, but that's true. We have the policemen, and all they come from the people. And public control, NGO control, and supervision are also very important. But anyway, even most appropriate measures are taken. Some time will have to pass, some transition will be there to do away with that arbitrary rule, so that police officers are treated as the protector of law. Alexander Vladimirovich, are you going to make a contribution? Well, in this particular case, I admit that the problem is international, no matter what history a country had, and no matter what element of xenophobia is decisive at this point. And I admit that Ukraine is faced with the same challenge. And we can understand that we try to use our own recipes, but what is important is to learn from the best practices, to learn from the success stories of other countries. And only if there is a sound combination of all those measures, we will achieve a situation when confidence and trust to police and law enforcement agencies will be high. I am not aware of the country which has already solved all those problems.
Yeah, thank you. We have very special Japanese system of police. We have a police box in every corner of the town, where 1 or 2 policemen are stationed 24 hours and switch on the light, and almost all the time 1 policeman is sitting there, which assures the people the peace and safety in that town. they think that they may go to that small police station and they may be helped by the police. And, not the gangsters, but small criminals are very much afraid of that police box because he may be arrested very quickly if he does wrong things. This is a foundation for a kind of family criminal family system to support criminal sanctions. But indeed, we are not very peaceful. We have a very big gangster group, organized crime. They have a member throughout Japan. I heard that 150,000 members in one organization, big business. And so we are not necessarily very successful, but police folks could be an idea to help the security of the town and the people.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexander Vladimirovich. Some contribution of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Two questions to Mr. Brewer on the human rights and the rule of law. How shall we treat those U.S. servicemen who are accused of very serious breaches of human rights in Iraq and Afghanistan? Those are the past cases and all happened during the Bush administration, and the Obama administration distanced themselves from that, but they promised to do something with that. So far, human rights activists in the U.S. say that nothing or very little has been done. Is there any hope that something will be done till the election in November? And my next question goes to Mr. Clark. He raised a point about Libya, but you should also speak for the allies. Recently, Human Rights Watch report was published, and much was said there that civilian targets were also hit. Not entirely, but they're also hit, and the Council of Europe made a resolution to investigate those incidents, as well as some other institutions. So what's the position of Washington on that, given the fact that the Chicago summit is coming? And it's a pity that Mr. Clark left, but I think we'll have a chance to hear from him later. Thank you.
Excuse me. Well, first, obviously, with respect to the human rights violations, the President Obama ran in 2008 and could not have been more clear that under no circumstances would torture be condoned. The Attorney General has said that, and our record could not be more clear. And again, going back to my first answer a few hours ago, whether you agree with us or don't agree with us, we're transparent, we're clear. Our debates are in the open, and this is a great example also of checks and balances with the courts. Now, I in the criminal division don't handle these particular cases, and so I'm actually not particularly clear about the specific cases you've referred to. There have been cases that have been brought. There's a public case where we have brought a case against Blackwater, which was one of the groups out there, and we have litigated it. My own lawyers, in the rule of law, they had very excellent defense lawyers. They got a positive ruling in the district court. Then we went to the Court of Appeals. We prevailed in the Court of Appeals. And the case is back in the district court, and it'll be litigated. And so what I can tell you about the first is that through the rule of law, cases go through the system. Everybody's entitled to vigorous adversary representation, and we will continue to pursue those cases when we can. With respect to the second, I'm less familiar, other than to say that We again, more specifically, with respect to the targeting of certain enemy combatants or those in Iraq and in Afghanistan more generally, I don't know specifically what you were referring to. There's a very rigorous process, and I invite you to what John Brennan recently spoke about how our country at least identifies when it's going to take action, let's say, against Al-Qaeda, individuals in Al-Qaeda, and he was very clear even with respect to that. Our military in those circumstances does not target an entire group. It doesn't target an entire village. Rather, it targets an individual. And in those cases, it targets individuals who have a real nexus and commitment to attacking the United States or our allies, have actually moved in very material ways in doing so, pose a very real threat to us that they will continue to do what they're doing. And when our military feels it has actionable intelligence and it can target a person in a very discreet way, it reserves the right to do it. And even in that case, there's a very detailed process that's followed. And I think it's probably quite remarkable the level of detail that he was willing to provide in the openness and transparency that we support about how we make these decisions and what we do. That's not to say every case will be perfect. That's not to say that there will not be at times tragedies as a result. But there has to be a thoughtful approach towards the fight against terrorists who are so committed to creating such violence, and at least you have a good sense of how we do it.
Спасибо.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think we had quite an interesting dialogue about the rule of law in providing for the security of a nation. I have a question which is probably motivated by two reasons. First, to remind ourselves about gender policies and by some general provisions. Do you think there could be a priority in providing for any kind of security, any form of security, any national security? I'm talking about environmental security, informational, economic security, etc. Your question was which form of security is more important, or is a priority? My name is Zhanat Kuzavaeva from the Parliament of Kazakhstan. Who would like to respond to whether we can really pick up a particular type of security that would receive a priority, say technological or informational or military security? Which of them are more important? Human rights, perhaps? What could be the absolute priority for us?
Well, if we put it on a scale of importance and a time scale, what you raise are the most important threats to security, of course, because you are talking about threats to our planet and future life. And this has to do with the environment, of course. And then it is a question of food security. And these, of course, are interlinked also. We have developed a global economy where we transport yogurt or milk or milk dairy products hundreds of miles with great environmental costs. And when it comes to the crunch, of course, these are things we have to rethink from the very start. I think it is important that we don't downgrade the question of security. It's important to specify what one means. You know, after all, we want security in our close environment, in our home, in our workplace, and then we want to see the future as well. What I have my doubts about and sometimes fears about is that when states, and not the least the big states, enter into a close, near love affair in the fight against terrorism. And I was a bit worried when the Bush administration and the Russian administration became so in such close agreement in the fight against terrorism, whether it be Al-Qaeda or whatever it was. And here we are on a very dangerous borderline, I think, where human rights and the security of states come together. And this is why I think openness and fearlessness in posing questions to people like us, all of us, are so very important. And this is why I thank the Russians for organizing such a conference like this, an open conference where we discuss these things without any fear. We discuss everything, from Tibet, Russia, Guantanamo, everything. And this is what we need, more openness and more fearlessness.
Большое спасибо. Вы хотели...
Well, thank you very much. I understand that you wanted to ask a question, and this would be the last question, and then we would sum up our discussions.
My name is Halla Gunnarsdóttir. I come from Iceland. This is maybe following up on Mr. Jónason's comment on women's distrust in the justice system. It was brought to my attention that UN Women has devoted this year to women's access to justice. And I think because we are discussing security, I think it is often important to give it some attention, that security for one person can be completely different from security threats to another person. And we can have security threats from outside, and then from inside the states, and then inside the homes, which is especially relevant to women, because it's the #1 threat to women's health and lives in the world today, is violence committed by their partners or by relatives or by someone close to them. So what I would like to ask is maybe the other ministers to comment on, and other representatives to comment on best practices in this field. What is being done to take this up? Because the justice systems do not seem to be able to handle this topic.
I think it's very helpful when you have women in the police and in the public prosecution, because they can feel in the situation much better, and that's a good condition to avoid the second victimizing that might happen. And what you mentioned, what we need is trust in the system, because in Germany it's quite the same. We have a big dark number of offenses against women, and they keep quiet and suffer from it for a long time. We have a huge scandal in Germany concerning sexual offenses against young people, and it came up. Some of the victims now were ready to talk about 30 or 40 years later. It took them that time, and to build up the trust that they were missing up to now, to come out, and it's a big scandal, and because the churches were very much involved in it. The Roman Catholic, but also some Protestant churches, the schools, teachers were involved in it. And yes, it's a horrible thing, but we hope now it came up, and the victims are now ready to talk about, and well, a good thing would surely be if there's a woman in the police, in the investigation office. I'm a man, as you see, but I think it makes things easier, and you don't need to change the rules. You just can make it.
What I would say in answer is much of what I've said before. It's got to be education. It's got to be a comprehensive approach, and it's got to be transparent. Domestic violence, children, violence against women and partners comes in all sizes and shapes. It doesn't come from just one kind of community or one kind of educational background. It comes from all educational backgrounds, all economic backgrounds, and it's a pervasive problem. We have just been having a battle in our Congress on the Violence Against Women Act. It's a statute that we want to have, our administration wants renewed, and it provides for education. It provides for greater resources in the area. In many offices around the country, we have expert prosecutors who focus on this. We have police who focus on this. And in many urban areas now, we have a zero-tolerance policy. Now, occasionally that can be a problem, but the policy really is that if a complaint is made, the police must make the arrest. They can't decide at the scene that something didn't happen because of the fear that the spouse at that moment or the partner at that moment will be scared to bring the charges. And so it's educating in schools and educating in clinics. It's giving abused spouses another place to go and knowing that there is a place that they can be. It's prosecuting these cases. But I agree with you, it's a significant problem.
Я предлагаю начать.
Well, I would suggest to summarize our discussions here today, and what I would suggest is to again probably formulate some of the ideas that could be considered as the fruits of our discussions, and then perhaps if my colleagues, my panelists would like to say a few more words, then I would provide this opportunity to you. I think that we drew certain conclusions and results. First of all, I think all agree that it is not possible to tolerate or to legitimize any arbitrary decisions, even though such arbitrary decisions may be considered to be correct or proper. Second, I think we need to develop certain legal tools and instruments and also norms, national or bilateral, and also in terms of harmonizing our practices and looking for common approaches to solutions. And the third conclusion, I think that we can all make or consider to be our achievement, is that much in terms of achieving the balance of the rule of law, guaranteeing the human rights on the one hand and combating the threats to humanity on the other hand. this balance can be reached on the basis of a public accord, on the basis of common understanding and assessment of problems and threats. I'm not talking about really leveling people out and providing the same thoughts in their hands, but I think that our discussion was very interesting, and I can illustrate it with one short example in the end. We may have different ideas about what the US is doing, but remember I attended a hockey match and one spare evening. By the way, Slovaks won 5-1 Canada, and Russia is still struggling in its match. So I went to a hockey match, and then there's a big screen in that hall which showed some two young girls dressed casually, but the text below was that these are two young girls who serve their duty somewhere abroad, and they are in the U.S. Armed Forces. They probably didn't do anything heroic, but still they really protect their country. So 15,000 people rose and applauded to these two young girls. I think there's still something. I'm not saying that we all need to follow the example, but it tells us that there is some common understanding on certain issues in the US, and I'm happy to know about similar examples in my country, in Russia, when really people can pull together their resources and collect millions of rubles for surgery of a sick child, or when they are very active on a local level or on a municipal level. I think that this is probably the token of our success, and we need to really move forward to such unification, not to a totalitarian unification, but to a unification of our efforts against the common threats, against the challenges that we face today. How do we reach this? I think that my colleague Minister from Iceland said that we need to be more transparent and also lead a more productive dialogue on this, and this is again the prerequisite of our success. We need to go away from any standards, perhaps, and templates, or very narrow interests that we think beneficial to us today, but won't be the same in future. Everything actually is valuable and important for us today as the global people. We need to make the public of all the countries to be insiders but not outsiders of this very important process which we spent 3 hours to discuss. I would like to thank all of you who took part in this discussion. It was an active one, a proactive one, an interesting one. I thank you for your tolerance and patience. Hopefully this day, which we didn't see much activity or activeness from the audience, perhaps this would give you an impetus for more active work tomorrow during the second day of the forum. Thank you very much, and good luck to all of you.